Good afternoon. Today, I'd like to welcome everyone to GEP's virtual roadshow and procurement outlook for 2023, overcoming challenges and seizing opportunities. My name is Tom Zielinski, and I lead GEP's consulting and services in Australia and New Zealand. And today, I'll be joined by Bharath Raghavan, who's GEP's Vice President of Technology Services. Today, we have an information-rich seminar that goes through a lot of the challenges that we as procurement and supply chain leaders are facing globally today in a very tumultuous year, and we'll outline some of what leading firms are, different techniques that they're employing to address these challenges. So we believe you're going to have a lot of information from this that's easily actionable and certainly food for thought as you manage your supply chains and manage your procurement organizations this year and into the future. Before we proceed with the webinar, there's a couple of things that I'll just mention. We have some attachments that you can see on your screen. Those attachments include the white paper of the Procurement Outlook 2023, our global category outlook, which is quite rich in terms of a point of view on category transitions and outlooks for this current year, and a few other white papers that you might find of some interest. There's also an opportunity to add questions as you go through. So at the end of the webinar, time permitting, we'll go through some questions and we'll address some of those in real time, and those that we can't address today, we'll endeavor to respond to those by email afterwards. So that's just something that you can familiarize yourself as we go through today's presentation. So I'll proceed with the presentation, and once again, thank you for joining and the opportunity to have this discussion today. Before we go into the actual content of the roadshow, I'll just give a brief introduction to GEP and who we are for those who might not be aware of GEP yet. So we are a global supply chain and procurement consulting services and technology firm. We're a global leader in this particular area. And as you can see by some of the metrics on the screen, we've got a wide array of customers around the world, over 110 countries. We have 6,000 employees, major offices in all the continents around the world, and we've been in business for over 20 years with representation around the world. We focus on end-to-end solutions, strictly on procurement and supply chain and the various enabling capabilities that provides organizations. Across the region, across the Asia Pacific region, we've got representation in many of the key countries, as you can see on the map on the left. And some of the key highlights is that we manage around 55 billion spend across the region, over 60 clients, and work across industries and support all of the key languages across the region. What we do in a nutshell is really work around the entire procurement and supply chain lifecycle. So as you can see in the center, right from planning, procurement, manufacturing, and logistics and delivery is the core value chain that we work across. On the left-hand side, you'll see our core services, strategy and consulting, software platforms that we'll touch on, and managed services are what we provide. And what we enable our clients to do is really drive their organizations forward with some of the outcomes that you can see, from reduced cost, improved service, improved bottom line performance, cash flow, minimizing risk, and optimizing working capital, and ultimately gaining competitive advantage across their competitors. So that's what we do in a nutshell. Our industry experience ranges across all of the key industries, and we're proud to serve leading organizations in each of these industries, as you can see on the screen, right from pharmaceuticals through oil and gas, public sector, retail, consumer products, right through the industries that you can see. We've got particularly deep category experience based on what we do as an organization. We manage over 300 billion in spend annually for organizations, and as a result of that, we have deep category experience across both direct and indirect categories, and a snapshot of that is shown on your screen in terms of the experience that we can bring. A lot of this is shown, a point of view on some of the categories and the current prospects this year are shown in the Global Category Outlook, which is one of the documents that I mentioned that you can download, shown on your screen. It's also available on our website and through our GEP Go app. And finally, in terms of the brief introduction of GEP, we've got extensive digital and technology platforms that help enable procurement and supply chain performance for our clients. The names of the platforms are SMART for our source to contract and procure to pay platform, GEP Next for our supply chain platform, integration across GEP Click enabled by that, and then our AI platforms and capabilities are provided by GEP Minerva. So it provides a holistic capability to support organizations with a common cloud-based, low-code, no-code architecture, and it's enabled by AI and on a common code platform across both procurement and supply chain. So it's an area that's enabling a lot of our clients drive tremendous efficiencies across their supply chains. So that's a very brief overview to what we are and how we perform services for our clients. I'll move into the core presentation for today's webinar now. Our global outlook, and this year is certainly a very challenging year. Our global outlook outlines a lot of the current factors that are challenging organizations and all of us as leaders today. Some of the key challenges that are being faced right now, first of all, is inflation that we're all experiencing. It's record multi-decade high levels of inflation across all major economies. And the latest forecast is around a 6.5% forecast over the course of the year, with a gradual decline in some major economies towards the latter part of the year, but still remaining much higher than the long-term trend. Interest rates remain stubbornly high. There is some views that we're topping out on that in some markets, but recently, certainly in the US, the Fed has it at 5%. The ECB still also high, and most of the economies are keeping interest rates high at the moment, although monitoring very, very closely around when that might be peaked, when that'll peak to manage that against the global slowdowns. GDP right now is expected to be only 2.8% for the year. The forecast for the remainder of the year remains to be very muted. In the United States, it's line ball whether or not the US will enter into recessions. I know here in Australia, it's about a forecast for about a 1.6% growth by the end of the year. So certainly moving into the risk of recession across most economies. One of the major factors, of course, driving that is the geopolitical tensions right now. The conflict in Russia and Ukraine continues to continue unabated. There's the tensions around China and Taiwan, and of course, the China-American trade sanctions and the economic factors that are coming into play. Some of the recent legislation put in place by the US is creating some tensions in that regard as well too. So certainly from a geopolitical perspective, there's tensions that are challenging supply chains globally. And finally, energy remains stubbornly high. Energy costs, input costs remain high, continue to be impacted by the war in Ukraine, of course, taking out a lot of the Russian energy production out of the equation. So those are all some of the challenges, of course, that we're all experiencing at the current moment. What leaders are doing to address these challenges, and this will be the majority of what we talk to in today's presentation, are these 7 factors. The first is the rise of the corporate citizen, the emergence of empowered supply chains. ESG is a core factor in delivering ESG outcomes through supply chain operations is another factor that leaders are driving. Cultivating a digital-first supply chain, leading through and overcoming the challenges of inflation, and there's a number of tools and techniques that organizations are adopting that I'll touch on. Rethinking supply chain and procurement metrics. And finally, the war on talent continues, unabated, of course, and some of the ways of work that we're now employing give organizations an opportunity to tap into perhaps previously untapped talent pools. I'll drill into each of these as we proceed in a moment. So the first trend, the rise of the corporate citizen, is an interesting one. When you look at the various, for some recent surveys, trust in government, trust in politicians, even fellow citizens, is continuing to erode. Interestingly enough, many employees, 61%, trust their CEO more than they would trust some of those other other players that I've just touched on. So that's one important factor. The second one in some of the recent surveys shows that 54% of staff would be willing to work for an willing to take a pay cut if their organization aligned with their own personal values. 56% of employees wouldn't work for an organization that even aligns with their values. That statistic isn't shown, but that's another one. Investors are also stating and investing in organizations that are aligned with values. So there's a 1.1 trillion amount of investment that's being aligned much more towards organizations that are in line with more progressive and aligned values. So certainly the rise of corporate citizenship is being backed up by the investment dollars. What organizations are doing to align with the values of society and some of their employees are shown on the right. Social procurement certainly is becoming an increasing trend, and a lot of organizations are adopting it really, and that means purchasing from suppliers who can help enhance their company's values and vision. That's the first major trend in this regard. Organizations are also increasingly adopting peer partnerships, and some of the types of partnerships that you can see on the right-hand slide, on the right-hand portion of the slide, from sustainable procurement pledges through consortiums and consortia with other like-minded organizations to address common values is an increasing trend for organizations today. The white paper outlines some of these in greater depth, but those are one of the major elements of the trend towards the rise of corporate citizenship. The second next trend is really delivering ESG outcomes through supply chain operations, and that's an increasing trend throughout organizations today. Organizations can see the pressures, and we all can see the pressures from increasing public pressure, demand for sustainable products, increasing government regulations, and employees favoring strong ESG policies. That pressure continues to be there. Organizations, and we are all faced with challenges in being able to execute this. Three things that leading organizations are doing to help address this are shown on the right. The first is getting the data correct in order to analyze and properly assess what the baseline is for emissions is the first one. It's addressing ESG is a data-rich endeavor, and getting the data right and being able to accurately measure scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is critical. The second is working with suppliers in the extended supply chain to use the leverage as a customer to help influence selections across the supply chain and purchasing decisions towards organizations that align and are able to perform some of the requirements for ESG. And finally, putting in place the right KPIs and measurement mechanisms to monitor across the supply chain is another factor that organizations are adopting to help drive ESG compliance. The next trend is cultivating a digital-first supply chain, and this allows organizations to better respond to unforeseen shocks and volatility across supply chain and procurement operations. Some of those various factors that organizations are putting in place are shown on the right, from putting in place the mechanisms and capabilities to have real-time data, advanced predictive analytics to better forecast changes and unforeseen events in the supply chain, improvements in forecasting, budgeting, and risk management is another capability that organizations are leveraging technology for. Forward performance management, performance planning across the supply chain, and automating technologies around some of the more repetitive and lower value activities are all factors that organizations are doing to leverage technology to create a digital-first supply chain. That trend certainly is marked by investment forecasts, 16.5% increase in supply chain investment across supply chains is forecast in the next 2 years, representing around a $6.3 trillion increase. The next trend, number 5, is leading through inflation. Really, leading organizations are thinking outside the box and employing a variety of different tools to address the high inflationary environment that we're currently experiencing. Some of the things that organizations are doing right now is really looking at adopting a variety of innovative strategies to address the inflation challenges in different ways. Data visibility continues to be a key enabler to being able to make the right decisions to respond to inflation. Increased cross-functional collaboration is a prevalent way, both within the organization as well as through the extended value chain, as a way of looking through and addressing opportunities for cost reduction or closer collaboration across planning and execution. Demand management, promoting and limiting consumption, promoting reuse within an organization and across the supply chain is another way that organizations are addressing this. And pre-qualifying suppliers in order to reduce risks are some of the tools that organizations are doing. Clearly, the challenges in terms of the increase in cost of labor and cost of raw materials is forcing a number of different changes across the supply chain and responses to address inflation. A number of different tools, still keeping with this trend, are shown on this slide, and as just a brief overview of what some of the tools that organizations are using to address the inflation and volatility are shown here. So, for example, on the left-hand side, commercial mechanisms, some of the more innovative mechanisms that are used, for example, efficiency improvements, reducing waste, revisiting contracts with current suppliers, strengthening strategic relationships and identifying and consolidating supplier relationships where this makes sense. Should cost modeling is an area we're seeing a tremendous amount of growth and interest in, and really breaking down costs in a very analytical fashion into the component parts, and then running very fact-based discussions with suppliers and supply chain partners around the should cost elements of contracts and relationships. Logistics contracts are getting a lot of attention as well too, in using various indices and different elements of the contracts that will allow better alignment with cost and service for organizations on the commercial side. So those are some of the things that are being done. The broader supply chain is getting a lot of attention as well, mapping the value chain across the supply chain and exploring opportunities to perform any activity in supply chain differently, and creating win-win scenarios is something that's getting increased attention given the current challenges. Offshoring and nearshoring and location of production and sources of supply is getting an increasingly close look through a lot of our clients, and pilot projects are being undertaken to explore opportunities to de-risk and lower costs across the supply chain. There's different elements in the engineering space. Value engineering and exploring alternative materials are a couple of the factors that organizations are looking at. And finally, on the financial side, hedging, pricing for margins are a couple of elements that are getting increased attention to manage costs and managing inputs in a much more rigorous fashion. So those are examples of some of the tools, only touching on these briefly today, but certainly there's a lot more material on each of these and many of these on our website. Certainly happy to have discussions around any of these if they seem to be an area that might be of interest to you. The sixth trend that we're seeing a lot of organizations address the current volatile and inflationary environment this year is really, with all of the foregoing challenges and responses, it only goes to follow that a re-examination of the appropriate supply chain metrics is necessary. So organizations are taking a look at what the appropriate metrics are for some of the new capabilities and new requirements for managing this year and in future years. So how best to capture or measure some of the new capabilities from a digital first supply chain visibility, improved capabilities around forecasting are a couple of those. Around ESG, that's an area that's getting a lot of attention in terms of new metrics, of course, around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions across the supply chain, and that's getting a lot of attention as far as new metrics to complement the current set of metrics that we have. A lot of focus on cost protection, P&L protection, and managing cost in terms of various elements of the supply chain and on the whole. And then finally, assurance of supply security, risk mitigation is getting a lot more focus, and there's a number of different metrics that are being looked at in terms of better managing and maintaining finger on the pulse of the metrics around supply security and risk management across the supply chain. There's a further explanation of this in the white paper that you can download, but certainly we're seeing a trend towards rethinking supply chain metrics given the current environment. And finally, the final trend that we'll touch on really talks to the war on talent, and one of the and coupled with that is objectives and goals that organizations have for DEI and diversity and inclusion. As we all have all organizations are dealing with challenges in terms of finding the right staff and some of the challenges around that. And coupled with that is the change in the work climate that we have right now with working from home and remote working across all organizations in many geographies. That provides an opportunity to take a look at perhaps other pools of talent that might not have been available in the past. And organizations, the leading organizations, are rethinking some of their job requirements, creating more neutral job descriptions to attract wider pools of talent, perhaps eliminating biases in both recruiting and hiring to ensure the most diverse talent pool can be accessed. So those are some of the things organizations are doing on the hiring side. Over the long term, it's more than just hiring. It takes a larger organizational holistic view of this to look at it from a policy perspective, ownership of DEI targets, some of the internal change management that's required, the right sort of internal and external communication around organizations' DEI goals, and then finally the right metrics to measure that. So DEI is one key trend that we see many organizations using to both increase the talent pool, increase the representation of their organization staff to better match society, and certainly it leads to win-win outcomes for organizations, the employees, and society as a whole. So that's certainly a trend that we can see. So that covers a brief snapshot of some of what we see organizations doing to respond to some of the challenges this year. Again, most of these and all of these are elaborated on the white paper. So I'll just conclude the actual presentation at this point, and I will stop sharing the screen and we'll move to some questions with Bharath in a moment. And there we can see Bharath. I'll just move to a couple of questions. Bharath, thank you for joining. And a couple of questions that are top of mind based on the overall trends and responses for organizations. From what you can see from your perspective, certainly from the other side of the region, how have you found organizations as a whole responding to some of the challenges? And is there anything you'd want to add in terms of the kinds of responses that you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. Tom, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I think I probably answer this in two parts, really. I think if you look at the cross spectrum of the organizations that we work with on a day-to-day basis, this seems to be emerging a story of what's happening in some of the brightest spots, notably around the Asia-Pac region in general, and some larger trends which are more stark and in some respects even more grave when you look at the rest of the developed world, right? The key things just to work that we see a lot of our global organizations grappling with, especially with footprint in the West, in the US, and so on, is inflation is still a concern. Clearly, it's been easing off, but it's just far too high for comfort, and most of the economies and the businesses are not used to operating at for lengths of time at these sort of inflationary conditions, right? The second common thing we're seeing across the board is really how that's kind of translating to, in some respects, together with the currency challenges in terms of the volatility of commodity prices. What that is causing is an extremely difficult time for business folks and planners to try and stabilize the price impact on their business, both in terms of input commodity as well as how they can potentially pass some of it back on to their customers, or in some cases they're not able to do so, right? So those are sort of clear challenges which started in 2022 but are clearly finding their way into 2023 as well. All of this impacted, of course, to a good extent by the larger situation with the interest rates in the US. Of course, the whole world sort of holds the breath to see how that's going to move and looks for trends and indications. But the recent sort of impact on some of the banks in the US is still, while ostensibly contained, is still sort of has created the further risk in what was already a fairly volatile situation to begin with, around a contagion impact starting to seep through to the banking system globally, right? Which of course is going to impact all global organizations in some respect or the other, right? So this much of what I just said is really sort of coming is a worldview to an extent based on what's happening in the developed economies, which are in many respects even more tightly linked and joined up, given the financial systems that drive the currency and the commodity markets are extremely closely tied with each other. Having said that, to your point, I think if you look at the same question through a regional lens, in particular, what's happening in South Asia, Southeast Asia, there are green shoots. It's fairly evident that if you go beyond 2023 into the future as well, in all likelihood, South Asia and Southeast Asia inclusive would continue to outperform global growth. The good news is inflation, the projections are it will fall down to 8.9% if you go with on the basis of some consensus reports, and even lower to around 7% in 2024, which is one of the key metrics. But on a larger level, there is clearly we're seeing there's an opportunity and adversity here. There has been a cooling down of the labor market, especially in certain industries and the services sector, which does present opportunities in the Asian context in particular, right? To even relook at some of the relevant sort of contractual arrangements and try to optimize if you look at that through the lens of a procurement professional. So the lowering of commodity prices, recovery in the services sector, and sort of more broadly sort of reduce disruptions in the value chain is starting to help customers with a larger footprint in Asia manage their global risks by continuing to invest and focus on how they can ride the wave, so to speak, in this part of the world. Everything put together, if you take truly global organizations, it's still very challenging, and I think the prognosis is that this is going to continue to be the case for most of 2023. I think you already mentioned in your opening, comments about the geopolitical risks, which are naturally overarching, right? So that's going to be the joker in the back, and I think much more remains to be said on that. But again, that's an evolving situation with a number of curveballs expected to come our way overall.
Yeah, certainly the global situation is certainly the black swan of the last year or two in terms of what that's causing supply chains and organizations as a whole. I guess besides the elements that we spoke about today, are there any other issues that are top of mind in the C-suite for CPOs or CSCOs that you're aware of, or that comes up in your discussions with clients?
Yeah, certainly, Tom. I think what COVID did to us was, and I say us, I'm talking for the corporate sector at large, cutting across industries and focal areas, is it sort of really zoomed in on the notion of supply chain resilience, right? That was something that was talked about. A lot of work was done, but it put a whole new perspective on what that means for companies when the rubber hits the road. Now, while thankfully the COVID pandemic has sort of is almost behind us, I dare say, and we are in the post-COVID world, uh, the resilience aspect continues to be a big risk, not so much because of what the pandemic did, but more because of what the geopolitical situation is continuing to unfold, where companies are having to almost second guess and plan and preempt certain supply chain bottlenecks, which could happen at any point in time, right? And that brings back the focus around continuity of supply, diversification of supplier base, managing your risk, and doing that against certain variables and factors on the geopolitical side, which are unable to forecast with any degree of accuracy, right? So that is, when you look at the C-suite and what is important for them, it is longer term vision and be able to take a call and stay true to it. This is one of the biggest challenges we are seeing. And strategies by definitions do not change by the day, but because you're not in a position to take a long-term calls on most things to do with investments in supply chain, it's a huge dilemma or conundrum for the C-suite in general, whether it's a CFO or the CEOs, to grapple with and almost take a punt on where things are going to go, right? So that's definitely one of the things that continues to be uppermost on the C-suite's mind. The other aspect I mentioned, commodity price, which again is important, but beyond that is the demand side challenge. Now, what's happened with COVID, of course, was Chinese demand did tank quite substantially, which was expected, and then it took a little longer to recover given some of the strategies around how they managed the COVID situation. Now, the good thing is what we're seeing in the last quarter and a couple of quarters, in fact, is the Chinese demand has picked up, right, which is good. But it's almost certain that it's never going to be at the trajectory and the levels that it was pre-COVID. But with the situation in the developed economies where they're actually facing a triple whammy of lower growth, high inflation, right, high interest rates, and I would say the fourth challenge, longer term challenge, is the demographics and the fact that the productive population as a percentage of total continues to diminish over time. Now, with the global demand from the West almost certainly on a lower trajectory, and Chinese demand, albeit the recovery going to be on a different trajectory as well, it does create a larger challenge in forecasting the demand equation for the C-suite, right? And then again, there are no simple answers to any of these, but clearly these are a couple of areas where we can clearly see that it's consuming the attention of the board in large organizations, both locally and globally.
Certainly, a lot of food for thought. Couple of additional questions that have arisen. One is something that seems to be top of mind for all of us nowadays, and we see a lot of it in the press, is the emergence of AI and how that's being used across the supply chain. We see and hear a lot about ChatGPT. What's your perspectives on AI across procurement and the supply chain? What are you seeing with some of the organizations that you serve?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. So of course, AI and ChatGPT is something in particular, something that we can't afford to not talk about. And as a company, of course, we have a view on AI generally, and more importantly, the disruptive change which ChatGPT is starting to bring about. Let me just quickly maybe take a couple of minutes to share our perspective on what it means from more through a procurement lens, right, in terms of areas where procurement can start and should start potentially piloting with ChatGPT. One is clearly where we can see some initial value and rapid sort of returns is on the area of research, right? Things like being able to perform quick market research, you look for new suppliers, products, right? And being able to sometimes just make sense in a very simplistic way of large complex research reports, which oftentimes is very value adding, but not the most easy to fathom, right? So research in general is an area where we are seeing ChatGPT already starting to play a role simply because of the ability to abstract at rapid pace, near real-time information and make it, usable, without a huge amount of effort. The second aspect is in the area of process efficiency, and again, I'm talking about this through the lens of a procurement organization for most part. Many of these sort of tools out there which have been discussed and they are in existence, ChatGPT is able to sort of start making some inroads like drafting simple RFPs, right? Statements of work, looking at how you can classify your spend using certain standard structures, and even looking, for instance, on things which every procurement professional would look, which is to understand mergers and acquisitions and how they can look at the contracts with existing players in a more holistic sense, right? Those things are things that they're a constant moving feast, but the fact that the chat GPT is able to synthesize that quickly is definitely going to add a lot of value. And we're already starting to see that as a procurement organization consulting for other customers. Lastly, and I guess this is just, I'm saying lastly, but in the context of some immediate opportunities we see here, is sort of really looking at some decision support mechanisms. So what ChatGPT can be leveraged is sort of it's a first level view. All of these are emerging, but clearly certain things around looking at your inventories and even start looking out across the supply chain as to who could be holding inventory that could help risk mitigate and manage your own stock better. And this kind of links back to my earlier comment around resilience and being able to go beyond the sort of your immediate situation and start looking beyond from a medium-term perspective. It does help in sort of quickly performing country-level sentiment analysis. And the reason is there are research reports galore, right, which all organizations have access to, but they are published from time to time. And what they do not necessarily do is to be able to give you quick, rapid insights as to how a global or regional event is actually changing the outlook on an economy. It's usually kind of buried in news feeds and news items all over the place. I think where ChatGPT can really help is to give a certain country level perspective or regional perspective based on a lot more real-time information, which is really where a lot of your decision making can fail if it's based on a certain view which no longer holds water, right? Again, these are just certain areas, Tom, where we see application for AI and ChatGPT in particular. As a company, of course, we are quite heavily invested in continuing to sort of embrace AI and ML across our product suite and the way we operate. So happy to field questions at the end with from the audience.
No, that's great. Great overview, Bharath. Thank you. And certainly it offers a tremendous amount of potential. I'm struck by seeing various uses of it amongst the clients that I work with. One senior manager in a client organization that I work with closely has adopted ChatGPT right from the outset, and indicates he probably uses it throughout the day. And about 80, you mentioned about 80% of the things he does, he's probably a first adopter in it, but he's certainly using it across the range of his activities throughout the day, and certainly has found a lot of innovative applications. So it's certainly an area that more and more people are trying to explore, and as you've touched on, there's some great applications in procurement. And for those attending the webinar, there's the GEP point of view is one of the handouts that you can download as far as ChatGPT is concerned. I think that's it for the questions that I can see at the moment. So if there's no other questions, I think we're reaching the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and I hope you found some insights, some useful insights from the topics that we raised, and some of what organizations are doing to respond. Of course, we've touched on everything at a high level. We're all very happy to elaborate on any of the elements that we touched on, Bharath, myself, or anyone from GEP. So please don't hesitate to reach out after the webinar if there's any additional questions that we haven't touched on today, or if you haven't had a chance to ask. And once again, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk and share some of these insights with you today.
Thank you.